Hanford is a place of contradiction. On the one hand, contaminated with decades of radioactive pollution, but on the other hand, a diverse and important landscape home to rare and unique species. Columbia Riverkeeper engages people in Hanford's complicated cleanup, focusing on the pollution to encourage people to hold the U.S. government accountable for cleanup. But there is so much more to this place than the pollution. Let's zoom in and explore Hanford's hidden treasures. From afar, Hanford looks like a hardened desert landscape, but this place is far from barren. In fact, once you look, you see it teeming with life. Despite an appearance that on some levels seems severe and desolate, this landscape holds a hidden beauty. And from a biodiversity standpoint, Hanford is a treasure. The Hanford Reach is characterized by a shrub-steppe ecosystem. This name comes from the Russian word steppe, or vast treeless plain. The landscape consists primarily of shrubs, bunch grasses, and forbs. Few trees dot the landscape, and from afar it might seem like a sea of sagebrush. In reality, it supports an incredibly diverse array of native plant communities, microbiotic crust, unique invertebrates, and plentiful wildlife species. While this may be news to some, native nations have used the area now occupied by Hanford since time immemorial, and the environment here has been described by the Confederated Tribes and Bands of Yakima Nation as a grocery store and pharmacy because of the vast amounts of traditional foods and medicines located here. However, this type of ecosystem, once dominant in the American West, is endangered. In fact, less than 12% of functional shrub-steppe ecosystem remains in Washington, and less than 1% is protected in an ecological condition similar to the original vegetation, making the Hanford Reach a rarity. Much of the shrub-steppe ecosystem at Hanford is relatively free of invasive species and retains the characteristic plants and animals that are no longer found in many other places. The environment at Hanford was accidentally protected by the U.S. government as an indirect result of creating a security buffer around the Manhattan Project activities. By limiting public access and development, the government set aside a wild place with little human disturbance for the past 80 years. Most of the shrub-steppe ecosystem in the U.S. has been degraded by grazing, mining, and development. Invasive species like non-native cheatgrass have crowded in and altered species interactions, transformed fire dynamics, and distorted ecosystem functions. Today, Hanford is the largest remaining intact shrub-steppe ecosystem. To understand how this type of landscape has become so threatened, it's worth exploring what impels many conservation efforts in the U.S. Our protections are typically driven by aesthetics, but beautiful does not necessarily equal biologically diverse or biologically critical. Our most critical habitats are not always the most visually astounding. Desert and shrub-steppe habitats might not visually get everyone's heart pounding, but these places are not a wasteland. Hanford is a refuge for disappearing plants and home for rare, endangered, and previously unknown plants, such as the White Bluffs bladderpod and the Umtanum desert buckwheat, that exist nowhere else. As we familiarize ourselves with this landscape, we see it as in no way devoid of beauty. The snow sparkles in the midwinter sun, and come spring, showy flowering plants like phlox, balsam root, and lupin paint the landscape in their annual fashion show. At the Hanford Reach, we find sagebrush obligate species that are completely dependent on sagebrush for their survival. Birds like burrowing owls, loggerhead shrikes, sage thrashers and long-billed curlews, and mammals such as sagebrush voles, Merriam shrews, and black-tailed jackrabbits wouldn't exist without sagebrush. Even some lizards and snakes depend entirely on sagebrush for food or habitat. Native nations have long fought to protect the important natural resources found at Hanford. It's time that we listen and recognize the biological importance of this ecosystem. While the U.S. government's nuclear weapons race may have initially protected the landscape by accident, we must now be intentional in how we treat it moving forward. For the people that depend on clean water, for salmon, And for countless other critters that thrive in the Hanford Reach, cleanup at Hanford matters. The Hanford Reach is a treasure and a singular and increasingly rare habitat.